Good evening and welcome to another edition of Africa's Boardroom. I'm Stephen Gunnion. Over the next 30 minutes, my guest and I will be delving into the value of learning. I'm joined by Steve Smith. He's Senior Executive at Accenture South Africa. Brian Chinsamy, Head of Learning and Development at ABSA Retail Bank. Richard Clarke, Senior Executive at Accenture Australia, and Charl, Cuyler, he's the GM for Organisational Development and Learning at the MTN Group. Welcome everybody, thanks for coming in. Steve, I'm going to start with you. When a company is going through a transformation, perhaps introducing new technologies, how important is it for the learning process to be kept intact with that before you go live?
Well, Stephen, learning is going to happen. It's going to happen in any case. And it's the effectiveness of that learning which becomes so critical. And the opportunity in any transformation process for your learning to become a key enabler and a key catalyst of that transformation process is something which is quite often overlooked.
Brian, is there any points in investing in new systems and transforming an organisation if you don't put the learning processes in place ahead of time?
Yeah. Now, I think one needs to consider that learning is but a vehicle, and the vehicle is the performance of the employee. And learning just enables that employee to perform better. And I think it's so important that if you get the learning right, the performance can be right. And so I think it's critical that an organization looks at how it structures its learning so that it improves the performance of its individuals in transforming the organization.
Richard, is this something that all organizations should be doing all the time, investing in training and teaching their employees?
Absolutely, Steve. I mean, you think about the massive investments that are made, say, in new infrastructure or technology, and unless organisations are prepared to make the right investment in their people to learn to use those new assets, then they're not going to get return on investment.
Is this a critical advantage that a company will get from investing in learning, Charl?
Absolutely. I think companies are realising that it's more than just the investment in learning. It's actually part of the whole employer's value proposition. So it becomes a brand, it becomes something that attracts talent and also retains talent.
Steve, what's the starting point for this?
I think the starting point really ties back to the strategy of the organisation and where the organisation is going, where the transformation process or project might well be going to, and starting with that and understanding what's going to change within the organisation. What are those core capabilities, those core skills that you need to build as you go through that transformation process, and on the basis of that, building up the appropriate learning vehicles to in fact assist that.
So really, Brian, you would have to look at a company's vision into the future, where it would aim to be in 5–10 years' time, and then start the learning process from there.
Absolutely. I think it needs, you need to look at currently where your skills are in your organization. What roles do you have? What are those mission critical roles that you require to take that strategy going forward? And then look at what is your strategy, what are the skills you require at that point, and look at how do you close that gap. It might mean that you've got to make strategic choices of whether you buy those skills or would you build those skills within your organization, and the company needs to decide what direction it takes for many of these mission critical roles.
Well, Steve, I think we've discussed this in studio before, the whole HR function of an organization, and really the learning function is very closely aligned to the HR function, and that's why you want to have the HR director on your board helping to determine your vision, isn't it?
I mean, absolutely. You know, the studies that we've conducted, really the top issues, out of the top 10 issues that CEOs and CEOs worry about around the world, 4 of those relate to the areas of organizational performance, human performance, learning. Excuse me, those components. And on the basis of that, that has to be a top agenda item. From a learning perspective, though, I think that what I've come across, and I'm sure my colleagues over here have had similar experiences, where companies have big budgets in terms of learning because there's benefits to doing and making sure you in fact are spending money on learning, but how well is that aligned? And just picking up on the point that Brian raised just now, and making sure that it's aligned strategically. You won't believe how often organizations really are just spending it just for the sake of getting it done, getting it spent, rather than focusing it on driving the strategy of the organization. And I think the interesting thing that comes out of all of that is that there's very often consequences, though, to people that are now operating differently. So the organization could well look differently from that. You need to deal with the consequence of that. You could have a lot of people who are redundant, for example, as a result of additional new learning processes and organisational processes.
Well, Richard, Brian mentioned perhaps buying skills. Wouldn't it be easier, cheaper and faster just to go and buy the skills you need to take your organisation into the future than training staff in your organisation already?
Sometimes, but I think, Stephen, it's about First, looking at whether those skills are actually available in the marketplace. And oftentimes with these business transformations, particularly where they're really aimed at giving a company a competitive advantage against their peer group, those skills may not be readily available in the marketplace. And so in that situation, it drives competitive advantage for an organisation to actually define and develop those skills for themselves.
Charl, how do you measure the value of learning within an organisation?
It's probably one of the most important topics that is being asked by executives. How do we get the best value from our learning? I think it starts with making sure that there is a scorecard in place that is actually integrated into the agenda of the executive discussion, and that the dialogue around key performance indicators that are not just financially driven, but are also driven around how many people are we reaching, are we addressing the right skills, are we investing in the right learning technologies. So that's key, starting with the right scorecard and making sure that it's part of the executive discussion in the boardroom, right at the top.
Well, Richard, you mentioned getting a competitive advantage through that learning. You've been involved, your company in Australia has been involved with Telstra, and that's a big Australian telecommunications company. Perhaps describe what you did for them and how you could actually measure the value of what you did for Telstra.
Yeah, okay. Well, what we've done at Telstra is we've created the Telstra Learning Academy, which is a huge $200 million investment in their field and technical workforce over 5 years. And that is to support a large business transformation, as I was describing before. And just to pick up on Charl's approach to measuring the impact of learning, that's absolutely consistent with what we've done. And we've actually measured the impact in 3 ways. Firstly is that alignment with the key business indicators, so that you're measuring the same thing and what's important to the business. Secondly, as we roll out aspects of the transformation in terms of various programs, those programs have a business case in themselves that's driving towards particular business outcomes. And learning is a key contributor to those outcomes. So if we're driving, say, a productivity improvement or a customer service improvement, then the learning aspect is recognised and acknowledged as being a key driver towards that. And then the third way is that in certain circumstances we actually want to isolate the impact of learning from all of the other factors that are driving improvement. And so we have a methodology around how we can measure that through the use of control groups, so we can actually see the value, the individual value the learning is driving. That's not always required, but a combination of those 3 ways are how we get to that driving of business value.
And of course there were 23,000 employees involved in this learning process. Would all of those employees have gone through the Learning Academy?
Yes, we've now in fact after 4 years of operation trained almost 50,000 individuals. The 23,000 from the operations group, we've recently taken on the consumer group as well, which is another 6,000. So yeah, it's touching everybody in the company.
And how do you access all of those people and send them to an academy? Do you have to do it remotely? Do they all have to come to a central point?
It's a combination. I mean, we run 2 large physical centres in Sydney and Melbourne, which are where the main areas of the population are, but we also have a very, very distributed audience, and we deliver training in over 200 locations in Australia, and it's a very vast continent. But also, and this is where we use Telstra's networks as well, we deliver a lot of training via technology methods, whether that's virtual instructor training or online web-based training. We're getting to those people in the place where they work as well as bringing them into centres.
Well, Brian, you've been involved in training at ABSA Retail Bank, setting up a whole training program there. How do you train, and of course we know that again thousands of employees are involved there, how do you train them without losing productivity at the bank?
Well, Stephen, maybe before I answer that question, let's just talk about training versus learning, because you speak about training, and I'm saying we've moved out of the training paradigm into a learning paradigm.
Is there a difference?
Yes, there is a difference. Because the training paradigm focuses very much on the relationship between a trainer and a learner, with the idea of pulling people out of their workplaces, pulling them into centralized training rooms, and plugging them with content. We're saying that business is changing so rapidly, the world is changing so rapidly, the world is getting flat, as Thomas Friedman says, that you don't really have the luxury of doing that anymore, because by the time you bring people back to training, the content has changed. The mind can just take just so much of content. And so we've kind of turned it on its head and we said, let's move into a learning paradigm. And a learning paradigm says, well, what is important is that you teach people principle-based knowledge and give them access to information.
What do you mean principle-based knowledge?
So if I'm training a salesperson, I'll bring him into a room for a shorter period of time, give him the principle-based knowledge of selling. What is good selling techniques, and give him access to find information, people in a true knowledge managed environment, so that he'll be able to upskill himself at his workplace. Provide him some performance coaching so that he can explore what we've brought him to understand what good selling is and take that further into his workplace. So there's a fundamental difference between the training paradigm and the learning paradigm.
And it sounds more empowering as well for the learner.
Absolutely. So the learner takes the responsibility, together with his line manager, of course, of ensuring that he is the best performer at work. And there's a what's in it for me also at the same time for him. So one needs to make that shift from a training to a learning paradigm, and that is why we've kind of changed the structure to support this new strategy in the bank. It's a learning paradigm. It's moving from trainers to facilitators. It's less reliance on classrooms.
More dynamic,
but more interactive, providing people the opportunity of contributing to other people's knowledge in a real dynamic knowledge management way.
Well, just before we go to break, when you explain what you have done at ABSA Retail Bank and the success you've seen from that.
All right. We had to, external audits showed that the number of training days we were providing, the number of days we were moving people out of the workplace into a classroom was really not having the business impact. So we looked at, well, how are the ways adults learn? What are the ways adults learn? And brought that to bear on the way that learning and development should happen. For example, adults learn by making mistakes, but in the financial industry, as you very well know, it's taboo to make a mistake.
Well, I think we've seen a few of those mistakes recently.
So we are saying, well, can't we use the whole idea of errors and mistakes and use it in a risk-managed environment so that people learn from that? Another example is that the use of the performance coach. We really know the power of a good coach, a performance coach with an employee, and we're saying, why don't we let people use that learning in a risk-managed environment in the presence of customers, but have a performance coach actually supporting the person when the person makes a mistake or needs to learn something better. So it's a combination of getting some principle-based learning in the classroom, allowing the person to go to a center of excellence where the performance coach can help the person, and then put the person in the workplace where that learning continues with his line manager.